Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of UCLA Forecast Direct. I'm William Yu, an economist with the UCLA Anderson Forecast. Today, we are going to discuss an important topic, the policy impacts and implication of the second Trump administration. We are thrilled to have Dr. William Li with us today. Dr. Li is the chief economist at the Milken Institute, where he focuses on developing policy that improve access to capital markets, enhance financial stability, and support job creation through better global economic and regulatory conditions. He works closely with policymakers, thought leaders, and market participants to create actionable solutions. Dr. Li brings an incredible wealth of experience. He studied as an economist at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., before becoming a division chief at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Later, he served as deputy division chief at the IMF, where he established its Hong Kong office. In 2011, he joined Citigroup as a managing director. So we are very honored to have Dr. Li with us, and we are excited to hear his insight. Dr. Li, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Professor Yu, this is fantastic. This is a great experience. I have paid a lot of attention to your forecasting services over the years. You guys are really at the top of the line when it comes to people providing this kind of forecasting services, consistently high quality. So I am truly honored to be on this program with you.
Okay, honor is ours. Okay, I'm very happy to hear that. So let's get started. So could you give us your takes on the impacts and implication of the policy in Trump 2.0, in particular for his policy on trade, tariff, and investment?
Well, William, over the last 2 weeks or so, there have been a lot of meetings, not only in the United States, but around the world. The G20, the Asia Pacific cooperative APEC nations, met with CEOs in Lima, Peru. Here in the United States, I've been engaged in a lot of conversations, and the main topic of conversation is, what does President Trump do to economic policies? Where does it shift the U.S. balance? And I think everyone's expecting a big, major shift in policy, a lot of changes that really might affect not only investment opportunities, but also how the real economy operates. One of the things that I found to be very dismaying over the last several years is that when I look at outlooks, when I look at the forecasts, including yours, it seems not only is consumption traditionally the main driver of growth, but the basis of that growth of consumption has become more and more narrow. One of the things that I think, as you know, the growth in consumption, more and more of it is on a narrower and narrower base. 40% of total consumption growth can be attributed to about 20% of the population. So that kind of stratification of where the growth is coming from, to me, is a source of risk in the U.S. economy. President Trump came in with a mandate, and it says, well, a lot of that growth is taking place and powered by people who have wealth. The stock market wealth and increase in real estate values has been a source of savings in which they can dip into. But if you actually look at the labor market and income produced in the U.S. labor market, that itself has become more and more difficult, because one of the things that brought President Trump into office is that you hear anecdotal evidence more and more, people saying, I just can't make ends meet. I am having a lot of troubles. And yet you look at the aggregate numbers and as you and other forecasts point out, we are at historically low unemployment rates. 4% to 4.5% is considered normal for the U.S. economy, and we're right there. So why is it that GDP growth is above trend, 2.2, 2.8, somewhere in that range, is about a percentage point above what the natural rate of growth is. So if the aggregate numbers look so good, why are so many people complaining? And so if you delve into the labor market numbers, what you find out is that even though payroll growth has been 180, 200,000 per month on average over the last several years, the number of people getting employed, the number of people being employed has averaged this year about 31,000 per month. So that big disparities means that more and more people are having to get second and third jobs just to make ends meet. That, I think, is the main insight that I think can give us a foundation for our discussion as to what economic policies will be doing. Because President Trump, I think, is elected to address exactly that problem. Right? When people say, I just can't make ends meet, inflation is just making it so difficult for me to just pay for enough food for breakfast. I have to allocate bacon among my children because I can't get the amount of bacon that everybody wants to have. And I think that kind of income disparity and wealth disparity has grown larger and larger in this economy, partly because of policies, but also partly because of the way technology and trade has changed the distribution of income, has affected what sectors get job growth and what sectors get high value added, high paying jobs. And I think those are the topics I'd like to focus our discussion on and say that, well, the anticipation is, well, President Trump's going to come in and he's going to try to reduce taxes. He's going to try to promote more job growth in the United States. And in doing so, he's going to use not only the traditional monetary fiscal policy tools that we talk about all the time, but he's also going to use industrial policy. He's also going to use trade policy. And that's where the international discussion starts to get nervous. Oh my God, President Trump is talking about 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, maybe 100% tariffs. And he's not just talking about targeted tariffs the way he did before, but now he's talking about blanket tariffs, right? A blanket use of tariffs, not just with China, our main economic competitor, but also with Europe, our allies. And I think that's the talk that's got a lot of people nervous. And I would like to bring some perspective into that. And let me end my introductory remarks here and say the tariff discussion has permeated all discussions on the international scene. The G20 discussion, the APEC meetings discussions, President Xi, right, was all over Latin America, getting people nervous about what U.S. policy is going to do and trying to make more and more alliances with individual leaders in order to make more inroads into what has traditionally been a U.S. sphere of influence in Latin America. So I think these are the trends I think that are reshaping the economic scene going forward, and that's the main topic of discussion internationally, domestically, among investors, and also among the Washington policymakers.
Yeah, very interesting. I fully agree with what you say. So could you give us more specific, what will happen when President Trump implement his American First policy in terms of, for example, whether it's a negotiation or really impose the tariff, whether it's on China or broader the rest of the world, how is it going to impact? What will we see? Will it impact the international trade flow? How does that impact the domestic manufacturing? Are we going to see more FDI and so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I'm glad you asked it. But let me put some perspective on this Make America Great revitalization of the American economy. President Trump was elected into office in 2016, right? And the first time. Now, 2016 was about the time when China came out with Made in China 2025. 10 years ago, China made it a clear objective, Li Keqiang's plan, right, for revitalizing the Chinese economy. And what was that plan? To provide subsidies, low interest loans, and joint ventures as much as possible to develop new technologies. And they were going to favor certain areas, and they selectively and strategically picked these areas: robotics, new energy vehicles like electric vehicles, solar panels, pharmaceuticals, robotics, and about 6 or 7 other main areas of revitalization, because China felt that they wanted to be the standard setters for industries and sectors in which the United States didn't have dominance. So robotics, AI, Internet of Things, pharmaceuticals, these are areas where they saw as opportunities where China can become the standard setter. China can become the leaders. And these are also high value added sectors that would offset what was back then even starting a growing trend of more and more low value added companies moving out of China to Vietnam and other parts of ASEAN, and even through Belt and Road into Eastern Europe. So there's a lot of exodus even starting then. And I think it was very insightful of Li Keqiang to the premier of China, the number 2 man who was in charge of the economic policies back then, for him to see that they had to do something about that trend. So that plan of Made in China 2025 to provide subsidies to develop these 10 areas to make China the leader, that was what was going on then. Flash forward to now, they've been incredibly successful. They are the leaders in new energy production, solar panels, electric vehicles, and they are really very good robotics. They were almost neck and neck with the United States for a while there in manufacturing of semiconductors. They were maybe 3 or 5 years behind, and they were only short some technology. So President Trump came into office seeing that the globalization of supply chains made China more and more the focal point of manufacturing, not just low value added manufacturing, but more and more high value added manufacturing as the Made in China 25 subsidies started to take hold. So I think one thing he put in place was, we need to have a level playing field. We need to have policies that would give us the same advantages as what China is trying to build for itself. Now, as you know, he implemented what was very controversial about 2 years into his administration, tariff policies. And when you and I used to teach, well, I used to teach at Columbia, and I'm sure when you're teaching now, and you teach about international trade, tariffs are always in the United States regarded as terrible tools. They distort markets. They take us away from the benefits of free trade. But as maybe in your graduate classes or in your more advanced classes, you tell all your students, we don't have a world of free trade. We've never had a world of free trade. There have been market distortions all over the place. Adding on another distortion could make things better or could make things worse, depending on how you put that distortion on. In fancy jargon, it's called the theory of the second best, right? The theory of the second best says that when you add a distortion, it may or may not improve things depending on how you do it. So you got to be very careful of how you do it. When you put a tariff on, it has 2 effects. One, it taxes the importer of those goods. No doubt about it. The import of those goods is ultimately is not the consumer of those goods. So that's something to keep in mind. It produces also, by raising the prices of these imported goods, it produces a producer subsidy. Those who are producing similar products in the United States have the advantage of having higher prices. So that's a subsidy for these domestic producers. The third thing you get with a tariff is revenue, government revenues. So President Trump said, I love tariffs because it lets me do what China is doing in China right now, add subsidies, but I have the subsidies paid for by government revenues and by this tax on importers. Now, people say, oh, you're just taxing U.S. citizens. You're taxing U.S. citizens to provide these subsidies. The answer is complex, yes or no, because who is the importer? If the importer is a domestic U.S. company like Walmart has to pay that import tax. It had choose to pass it on to the consumers or take it out of their profits or both. And usually, depending upon the price elasticity, how sensitive the consumers are to price increases, they will do one or the other more or less. So the tax is paid by a U.S. entity there. But if the importer is also a subsidiary of the foreign exporter, that importer still has to pay that tax, but now the foreigner pays it. That's why President Trump has said, I'm going to have the foreigners pay for it, because a lot of the things that he put tariffs on, the importer itself happened to be owned by the foreign entity. So that's the rationale for talking about why it is that foreigners could pay for some of the tariff and not necessarily American consumers. So that's a little bit complex, but I just wanted your listeners to know that in the real world, where instead of having a supply and demand curve and you have a tariff go up, and you say, oh, the consumer pays the tax, it's not the consumer necessarily. It depends upon various elasticities, supply elasticities, demand elasticities, and so on. And I'm sure you've given a lot of final exams where you've tested your your students' understanding of the topic by changing elasticities around and see who bears the burden of the tax or of the tariff. All right, so that's the substance. That's why President Trump seems to like tariffs so much. And we think of tariffs as having a terrible image because in 1930s, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs caused retaliations on it to the point where trade started to collapse around the world, and that contributed to the downturn in the United States economy and in the global economy. By the way, most studies show that Smoot-Hawley tariffs are not the cause of the Great Depression. The cause of the Great Depression was the drop in the money supply that contracted the U.S. economy to a great extent. But certainly, the collapse in world trade contributed to that. But remember, before the 1920s, the main source of revenue for the U.S. government was tariff revenue because it didn't have income taxes. So tariffs have had a traditional story in the U.S. economy. Alexander Hamilton used tariffs to do exactly what President Trump is trying to do, which is provide subsidies for domestic economies, domestic producers, and try to prevent foreign competition for long enough to give these industries, domestic industries, a chance to become more efficient. So those are the historic uses of tariffs that have had very good effects. The Smoot-Hawley is an example where it had terrible effects. And the difference between then and now, in many ways, is Smoot-Hawley occurred at a time when the U.S. was already in surplus, and now the U.S. is in a trade deficit. And as you know, and you can work this out for yourselves, the impact of a tariff will have very different impact on the domestic economy depending on whether you're a surplus or deficit positions. All right, so enough of the lecture. We get back to policies. President Trump is proposing tariffs as an important part of his policy to rebuild American industry and rebuild domestic supply chains. As I said, the impact of globalization has been to cause supply chains to more and more focus on the most efficient producer, which is China. So in many ways, the laws of economics are working. We are benefiting from a lot of low-cost production. But efficiency is really no longer the main objective of economic policy. There are national security, the safety of your supply chain, the integrity or robustness of your supply chain. COVID taught us that we cannot depend on just one supply chain. We need multiple supply chains. So as we move forward in the post-COVID world, already we are seeing a natural reshaping of globalization so that more and more countries are looking at different sources to supply their strategic imports. And that's exactly what the United States is doing. And so part of tariff policy is to try to reshape the supply chain in a way that will diversify and provide more safety, soundness, and robustness to that supply chain. And it's a way of rebuilding what are considered strategic industries for national security and also for safety of economic security itself, the production of key industries like semiconductors in the United States. So under President Biden, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really not inflation reduction, but really a subsidy for a lot of green sectors like electric vehicles and such. And also the CHIP Act, which subsidizes the production of high-tech industries. But again, the difference between these two acts is that they're direct subsidies. The government takes part of its tax revenue and gives it to the producers. The advantage, as I said, of a tariff is you have an automatic subsidy built into the tariff, and it's paid for by the government revenue and that comes from the tariff and the whoever the foreign importer is, whether it's domestic or foreign. So the subsidy itself is a partial benefit of what could already come from tariff policies and allow the tariff and tax and subsidy policy to be more inclusive in rebuilding American industry. So I think that's the analytics of why Trump has preferred using the tariff. But again, the caution I want to emphasize is that's the opening round of President Trump's discussion. We will introduce tariffs unless you do what? The second statement is unless you bring more jobs to the United States. Because what's the mandate of MAGA, Make America Great Again? More jobs for United States workers and higher paying jobs for United States workers. That's really the key. That's the policy goal. And so I think one of the things that we will discover is that the actual tariff that will be put in place will be much less than what is commonly thrown around as 60% or 80%, because in negotiating with different countries and with even different companies, you invest in the United States, you produce jobs in the United States, I lower the tariffs. And if you build enough jobs in the United States, I lower the tariff to zero. So I think that's the key to understanding the Trump policy procedures. Now, I'm not just making this up myself. I'm just not just dreaming this up. I've talked to a lot of Trump economic advisors. Some of them were in the Oval Office when President Trump was coming up with these policies in his first term. And they all assure me that what is really in President Trump's mind is create more jobs. And the tariffs are just one way of incentivizing more investment flows into the United States, into the key sectors and into the regions of the United States that most need added job creation.
Great. Very good, very good. So in fact, Dr. Lee, you probably know, over the past 30 years, China has successfully implemented a lot of tariff or non-tariff trade barrier in order to ask foreign company to invest directly in China. So that's how they can build this very successful supply chain, value chain, over the past 3 decades. And so it's very natural to think right now, United States is implementing similar things. So it's natural to think it probably will have this kind of same incentive to attract foreign company to invest in the United States. However, the critic will say China is different. United States is different from China. China used to have a very cheap labor environment, but United States is very expensive, especially over the past several years of high inflation. So I think personally, so that's why Trump bring this tax cut or deregulation. So my question for you is, to what extent this kind of upcoming deregulation and tax, whatever the incentive we're going to see, will help mitigate this kind of high cost investment environment in the United States in order to attract more FDI into the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, maybe one way of restating is, why would China come produce in a high cost producing area like the United States when it can produce at much lower costs back home? And given the state of the Chinese economy right now, it can't afford to lose high value added jobs to the United States because their own citizens, the Chinese economy is suffering from a lack of demand and also an insufficient number of newly created high jobs to employ new college graduates. So why would it come to the United States? It would never take Trump's offer, right? Well, that's a great question. I personally, I don't have a good answer for that, but I think if we look at the analysis a little bit, does cost determine everything? Labor costs. Well, the difference between producing in a Chinese factory where there's an overwhelming supply of what used to be cheap labor, but now becoming more and more expensive labor, you of course adapt your technology and your production techniques to the comparative advantage of where you're located. Comparative advantage of China, at least up till recently, has been cheap, high-skilled labor. So they have labor-intensive techniques there. If they come to the United States and build a factory in the United States, the one thing they're going to have to remember is U.S. has higher cost labor. So instead of using more labor, what do they use? More capital, right? Or more technology. Mike Milken, when I talked to Mike Milken, I did the same thing you did, which is say, why would China come here? It's so high, it's so costly to produce sneakers in the United States. Of course, they would never move the sneaker factory in the United States. If they're going to move it at all, they'll move it to Cambodia or Malaysia, where it's also low cost labor. And Mike Milken, who is really on top of a lot of the technologies and he's my boss, but he's also super rich, and I'm convinced he became super rich because he really has good insight into where to make money. And the Chinese can make money in the United States, according to Mike. It's cheaper to using the right technology and the right amount of capital. He said he has, and he didn't tell me who, he has examples of factories that are able to produce sneakers cheaper in Georgia than in China. So again, that's as I said, I can't quite name the name of the company and who's doing it, but I trust Mike in his own investment prowess to have tracked that down, and I feel very comfortable that, and also as an economist, it makes sense, right? If you change the mix of capital, labor, technology, and land, right, the major inputs of production, you can still optimize your product price, and if it's the right mix, you probably can dominate the less efficient older technologies that the Chinese are using in China. So I think that's one example of where the total cost of production, total factor productivity, is the main ingredient to decide how to produce and where to produce. So when President Trump is negotiating the tariffs, I think the easiest thing for him to do is to say, bring on your investment here, and let the market and the entrepreneurs who are here use your money as a joint venture here in the United States to create the factories and jobs that would work in the United States. And they will not be the same kind of factories and jobs that you had in China, or even the same factories and jobs that you're creating in Mexico right now, right? A lot of Chinese companies have decided to move to Mexico to take advantage of the Canada-Mexico trade, the NAFTA, revised NAFTA trade agreement, to try to bring imports back into the United States. So I think that is one way of answering your question, that I think it's not going to be a simple transplanting of Chinese factories and jobs here, but it'll be a transplanting of Chinese capital into the United States. And when you ask, and I know that in the audience, someone's going to say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, because why would a capital-rich economy like the United States take more capital from a capital-poor country like China, right? And I would remind our listener, whoever is asking that question, Robert Lucas, University of Chicago. It's called the Lucas paradox. What he found in his study of developing economies and of the causes of capital flows across countries is that on average, over the last whatever period of history you want to look, on average, capital flows from the less developed countries into the more developed countries, from capital poor to capital rich economies. That sort of defies intuition. And the rationale for that move is technology and productivity. Capital is much more productive in the United States, where which is a major source of innovation and using that capital, than China was. And that's one reason why it would make sense and it would profit the Chinese investor to move some of their capital from China and other emerging markets into the United States, because the United States is where the greatest amount of innovation, especially in AI and high tech and robotics and so on, is going on. Japan, right? It's like the center of robotics research. So the history has shown us that capital does move from capital poor countries to capital rich countries.
Yeah, very good. So Dr. Lee, you mentioned about Mexico. So actually, I was looking at the data right now. China is the major number one trade deficit country with the United States. Mexico become number two, and the number is rising. So over the past several years, since Trump imposed the tariff in China, you mentioned that the Chinese company, a lot of Asian company come into Mexico in order to take advantage of USMCA, no tariff between Mexico and United States. And Trump has said he has warned he might impose tariff, 100%, 200%, if the company a United States company move to Mexico because of lower cost. So what do you think? What will happen? Are those companies that already invest in Mexico, should they be worried about the potential tariff imposed by Trump administration?
One of my colleagues, Maggie Switek here at Milken, has been doing a lot of studies on a tool that we use called the Global Opportunity Index that measures different regions in terms of big array of criteria for what makes them good investment opportunities, what makes them good areas in which that foster high productivity investment. Mexico has been ranking higher and higher in terms of this metric, and so it's been an attractor of a lot of global capital. For the Chinese and for President Trump, I think what President Trump was saying was, you can't just take BYD cars, dump them into Mexico, right? Assemble 3 or 4 parts and then put the label made in Mexico, because they're not made in Mexico. So it's the made in Mexico or made in Cambodia or made in non-China country criteria is going to depend upon the amount of value added that takes place in those factories. In the United States and Canada and Mexico, I don't know if you know, but in order to manufacture a car in the United States, the parts that go into that car go back and forth between U.S. and Mexico, U.S. and Canada, Canada and Mexico, Mexico and Canada, Canada to U.S. That cross-border travel for the average car, the parts cross-border about 8 times. So in that sense, right, China can be part of that flow of products going across these 3 countries in a way that allows them to participate in the benefits of USMCA, because they provide more value added in this location, right? And it's not just importing the Chinese car from Shanghai and just assembling it here with no value added. So I think that's the key to at least the USMCA problem. But I think one thing that's also part of Maggie's work, Maggie Switek's work, numerous reports she's written about Mexico itself, shows that Mexico is really a logistics hub for all of Latin America. And so it's a hub for Latin America as well as North America. So it's a great location from which to export. And I think what President Xi has done in this latest trip, this G20 round, has been to strengthen more and create more bilateral treaties and bilateral trade associations that allow Chinese goods to flow not just from China, but also to circulate within Latin America. So I think the prospects of Chinese investments in Mexico, right, is probably going to grow, not diminish. And I think President Trump can be appeased, and his threat for putting on prohibitive tariffs against Chinese imports and exports is to make sure that the amount of value added that's done in this round robin of importing and exporting is really higher than 40% or whatever the criteria is to qualify as made in Mexico. So I think that is at least my way of seeing how they're going to get around this. And again, remember, President Trump's main objective is create more U.S. jobs and high-paying U.S. jobs to go back to what we said before, to appease the cries of the voters who say, I can't make ends meet. My job just doesn't pay enough, right? Because most of the jobs that were created in the United States for the last 5 years have been in leisure, hospitality, healthcare, and healthcare, like social services, not the high-paying doctors that are there, right? So I think the structure of the U.S. economy and its job-creating machine has really been more and more going toward these lower wage sectors. And I think the corrective policy that President Trump is trying to put in place is to shift more of the job creation into the high value added, high paying sectors.
Yeah, very good.
So, by the way, I have to say, the Milken Institute is nonpartisan. I'm not saying this because I'm a pro-Trump person. I'm just saying that this is how I interpret what the Trump policies have been, and will likely become going forward.
Yeah. So, Dr. Lee, you mentioned about, I agree with you, this kind of job creation is very important for Trump administration. But previously, you also mentioned about the concern of the national security. So what do you think? What kind of sector, what kind of companies will be welcome, like a Chinese company will be welcome in the United States, invest in the United States? What kind of sector will not be, because of this national security concern?
Well, that's a great question. In fact, I think it's going to be pretty clear that Huawei is going to have a very hard time selling internet switches here in the United States because even though it's a tool, it's a switch, right? Just a switch that you just put into the backbone of the internet. A lot of the Committee on Foreign Investment Assessment, the CFIUS, they will be evaluating dual uses of these Chinese imports, and if the switch can be used as an offensive weapon to cripple our power grid or cripple our internet communications domestically, that's not going to happen, right? So I think national security will always be something that the U.S. will bring up as a restriction for Chinese imports, regardless of whether the imports are created in Vietnam or China or anywhere else, right? If these imports can be used as a dual use, a weapon and a civilian use, those are going to have more difficulty passing the barrier. But I think also that's true for China. China has an enormous number of restrictions on U.S. exports coming into China. For example, government procurement, just general government procurement, right? The lack of transparency in China for what it is that they can buy for government work, government offices, is so biased toward domestic producers that I think hardly any or no foreigners supply governments there. Whereas the United States, government procurement procedures are much more liberal, and we have a lot of foreign goods that are part of the procurement process here in the United States. So I think for national security reasons, for sure, dual use possibilities for sure will be huge barriers that are going to be very difficult to cross. And those will be the kind of things that the tariff policies and the incentives and subsidies will be shifting toward producing more and more in the United States. Those strategic things, and not just electronics, but pharmaceuticals, right? We don't produce any basic pharmaceuticals anymore. And so I think those are things that will be viewed as strategic sectors in which we want more U.S. production, U.S.-owned production.
Great. So President Biden just attended APEC and G20 just over the past 2 weeks. So what do you think in the Trump administration, how U.S. policy toward this trade negotiation, in terms of bilateral, multilateral, what will happen, what will be changed, in terms of their pros and cons?
Professor Yu, as you know, that's my favorite topic. I've been in Korea, conferences in Korea, in Singapore, and here domestically with our investors. And one of the things I pointed out, which apparently people seem to be caught by surprise, except in Asia, is the difference between President Biden and President Trump in terms of negotiating trade agreements, is that President Trump is a deal maker. He wants a fast deal that can be done quickly and revised quickly, right? If circumstances change over time, you want to be able to revise that deal. So bilateral deals, right, one-on-one with a country, or even better, one-on-one with companies and with sectors, right, are easy to forge because they're very specific. And you can adapt them to different countries, right? I mean, my deal in semiconductors with Japan is going to be different than the similar deal I do with South Korea. And South Korea doesn't want the same deal that Japan got with us because South Korean producers have different objectives. For example, South Korea trades with China and the U.S. So when I was in Korea, they said, I hope the tensions go up because now we can trade with both. So I think one of the things that we keep in mind is President Trump is a bilateral deal maker. President Biden, from the very first day he came into offices, President Trump has ignored too many of our allies. We've excluded them from the policy-making decisions. So we want to be more inclusive and have more multilateral deals where everyone comes in. The Paris Climate Accord, right? The restructuring maybe the TPP, the Trans-Pacific trade agreements. He wants more all-inclusive deals. The trouble with that is that most people who've taken any political science course will know making a deal with a lot of entities is very hard because there's always one country that's going to say, no, I don't go along unless I get my way, right? There's always the holdout, right? The tyranny of the minority, right, is something that is very commonly talked about in political science. So these multilateral deals tend to take a long time. And once you forge them, it's also very difficult to revise. So I think the shift in focus you're going to see with President Trump is back to the bilateral deal making, which will be a lot of fast deals, small deals. They're not headliners. They're not like the USMCA where, big headlines, public discussion of them. They're going to be done almost privately, right? Which is the way it should be done. And that way, U.S. and the foreign country negotiators can do their best to maximize the benefits for their own citizens and for their own sectors. And to me, that is just, in economics terms, right? We're capturing all the producer and consumer surplus, right? Whereas with these general agreements, there's a lot of leftover stuff that can't be captured by the multilateral deals from an individual country's perspective.
Okay, great. So final question. We just talk about all these incentive. We're going to see hopefully more foreign direct investment in the United States to create jobs for middle class. So, Dr. Lee, do you have any suggestion for this newcomer? They do not know the environment in the United States. Do we have any lesson we can learn from, say, Japanese automakers, German automakers, Samsung you mentioned, and the reason why is TSMC building a factory in Arizona? Is any lesson we can learn to help those companies invest in the United States?
Well, the main complaint, certainly even when I was at Citibank, we had a very smart economist who was very well trained in the UK, but unfortunately he was a German citizen, and we wanted to get him to work on the Citi Global Economics team. The efforts that we went through to get him a visa was enormous. I mean, there was a while there where we thought we had to put him in London office in order for him to work out of London because he couldn't live in the United States. Well, eventually he was lucky and got the lottery, got the H-1B visa through the lottery. But those procedures that make it so difficult to hire high-skilled foreign workers is probably the biggest hindrance to increasing productivity and increasing the ability of the U.S. economy to produce high-paying jobs than anywhere else. Because even though we hired a high-paying worker from Germany to work on the U.S. team, right, his productivity was so high that in his going around to our clients, he provided enough value added that created investment opportunities and provided insights into investment opportunities that then further created many more U.S. jobs. So hiring a U.S. A foreign worker into a U.S. job doesn't mean you're displacing somebody, but it also means potentially adding more jobs as a externality from his own work, right? That high value added worker, high productivity worker creates more job opportunities in the United States. So I think the immigration policy is something that we in this country have to revise because we're losing so many graduate students and fellows in top universities to Canada because they are welcoming in a lot of high-trained scientists and engineers, and also to Europe. Europe right now recognizes the value of a more open immigration policy, especially for skilled workers. Now, the problem is, how do you decide who's a skilled worker, right? What skills are needed? And that administratively is very hard to deal with. And I don't have much to say about that. But the principle is that, my parents, came from China after World War II. My father was a waiter. My mother was a seamstress. And I was lucky enough to get the training to be able to go into a slightly higher value added job than being a waiter and a seamstress. Although I think, as you probably have heard, economists probably don't have much value added in the grand scheme of things. But at least the markets seem to recognize that there is some better value added of an economist versus a waiter and a seamstress.
Very good point. So Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.